So last night I again slept pretty well. I'm noticing these last 2 or 3 days I'm actually waking up earlier. It's taking me a little bit longer to fall asleep, but I wake up before my alarm and I'm waking up around 7 a.m. instead of sleeping till 9 if I have the chance. So I like that the days are a little bit longer, and that's good because then I'll get a little bit more tired being awake for longer and then fall asleep at night, which takes a little bit longer, but at least I have more hours in the day. And I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling pretty calm. I think it was last night I did notice a little bit of a strange anxiety type feeling around my diaphragm area when I was doing the coherence breathing, and I thought maybe that was going to affect my sleep or something, but it didn't. And last night was the first night I fell asleep without remembering. And what that means is the 2 or 3 nights before, since I did that last medication reduction, I really noticed when my body clicked into that semi-awake, semi-asleep state. And I was very conscious of it. I was very watchful of waiting for my body to click into that. And it took a while. And then when I noticed it clicked in that way I sort of recognized how long it took me to fall asleep. Whereas last night I just drifted off into sleep without going into that in-between. And I think that in-between is where that scary heart thing can happen. And so just falling asleep was kind of nice to not be like, oh, now I'm starting to fall asleep, I can feel that. And then still sort of being a little bit like wondering if I will fall asleep. So the process is still going well. It's pretty smooth, and hopefully it continues to be smooth. It's so smooth I don't even really think about it. I don't even really think about how I'm tapering off meds, and that's a pretty big deal. And at this rate, I will be off them by next Friday. So about 10 days. And maybe they'll recommend I stay on a smaller dose than 75 milligrams for a while too. I'm not sure. But we'll see how that goes. So that's my main focus right now, is coming off these meds, and I need to keep that in mind before I try to make other changes, like trying to eat healthy or putting any other kind of stress out there. And this morning when I was in the shower, I had an insight into how when we connect with this energy, we become a channel instead of an ego. And the ego, in a way, blocks the channel. It's like a dam. And so when those structures are not there, whether it's just temporarily, we become a channel for that time, and then we go back to our ego consciousness. And this could be part of the up and down of bipolar, is going between being a channel and just channeling the moment, and what we're saying isn't necessarily coming from our ego memory banks, to going back to being our ego. And a way to get with the process would be to channel more. And I remember watching a video by Victoria Budenko called 12 Steps to Raw Food. And she mentioned in it that we learn by channeling. And that statement always stayed with me. And in a way, a lot of my talking to myself is just channeling and learning from myself, or learning from that channel. And that's why I tend to learn from what I say, because it just sort of comes through me. I'm not really premeditating what I say. And I am excited to get off these meds and move on to the embodiment phase, because I'm reading this book, The Man Who Wasn't There, by Anil Ananthaswamy, and it's really well written. I don't read too many books like this, but it's really well written and it's quite fascinating to read. And in part of it, he's talking about people with Alzheimer's and how, even though in the late stages some people can barely say a word, some of them can't say anything, they've observed people able to perform certain ritual prayers in the right context. They just get up and perform the whole thing and say words and recite prayers, for example. I'm not saying it right, but they're saying that there's an embodied self that's deeper than these things that we lose through the process of Alzheimer's or degenerative brain diseases. And so what isn't lost, partially, is this embodied stuff, the stuff that really runs deep and is meaningful. And a lot of these story constructs and narratives we lose in that process. And I think too, in the process of bipolar, it changes our narrative. It changes our narrative in the process. It makes us give different narratives and speak about different things than even our own personal narrative a lot of the times. And what I don't like is how we're sort of forced into this narrative of having this mental illness, when how do we know that these narratives are really anything of value anyway? People lose it in Alzheimer's. Kids aren't being able to form these narratives with autism. Something's happening to the brain in general. It's almost like the human brain in general, not anyone's personal brain, is getting tired of living according to narratives. And it's actually breaking down the structures of those narratives. So what I'm saying is, the more we rely on those narrative structures, just a bunch of words, to generate and sustain our sense of self, the more in danger we are of losing that, because it's not as embodied. We could choose any number of narratives to have as our self-narrative, and that is just sort of a result of conditioning over time and experience. But there's something deeper than that. And I think that's what the process of map consciousness and trance consciousness is putting us into contact with. Because some of those structures are breaking down for us too. But we, at our age, we have a chance to connect with a different narrative, or make new narratives and new meanings, or find what's really meaningful. And I feel like a lot of times we do get in touch with that, and then we lose that, and then we're medicated away from ever really being in touch with that again, and fearing that, instead of really investigating what that was all about. And so that's why I think that the embodied part is really important. And even just talking to myself is embodied. It's embodied making up crap as I go along. And I think that keeps the brain fluid. I'm not caught in one narrative or two narratives, or just a certain number of bits of information, like this bit and that bit, maybe 100 little bits that I repeat to myself, and I call them myself. And then it starts to break down, and I wonder why it breaks down, when it's just these words in the brain, and these words in the brain cells that just make it almost like this locked in thing that is very susceptible to breakdown. It's not fluid. And I have no idea if this is true, but I find that whatever I read and explore, there's links to what I'm saying. And I would never want to be one to go in and study one particular aspect, because narrowing it down so much to one little thing is not really interesting to me at the moment. what's interesting is reading what other people are doing and seeing how it relates to what I've been talking about, and seeing just through talking to myself and past experience and context, and just trying to bring what other people are saying into the context of what I'm saying. Because people, if they haven't gone through this bipolar experience, wouldn't necessarily have the experience to all of a sudden want to make those connections. They wouldn't be able to. They haven't seen that worldview. So from the inside of that, I can look outside and pull outside context into this bipolar context, which anyone who's gone through this experience can do. But I feel a lot of us don't have the chance because of what we're told, how we're told to think about ourselves and look at ourselves and view ourselves, and how we have allowed others to see us, and we're not fascinated by our brains. We're afraid of it, and rightly so in a lot of regards, for sure. But I've been able to look at what people are saying and relate it to my experience. And the chapter I'm reading right now in the book actually is on schizophrenia and psychosis, and I've definitely had my days in psychosis, for sure. So it'll be interesting to see what he says about that. And I came across the term autonoetic consciousness, which, according to Wiki, is the human ability to mentally place ourselves in the past, in the future, or in counterfactual situations, and thus to be able to examine our own thoughts. What does counterfactual situations mean? It doesn't quite link to the right thing, but I feel like what I'm doing a little bit is autonoetic bipolar consciousness, because I'm examining thoughts and worldviews and perspective to bipolar. So the point about the narrative as the self, which is questionable, but we take our narrative to be ourself. If we take ourselves to be a bunch of words and we lose words, or words break down, or our brain cells break down, then what are we? And to me, we've spent so much time in this narrative about ourselves, we're not really in touch with consciousness. Through the bipolar process, we get in touch with this real self, and it's scary, it's energetic, it's living, it's dynamic, it's fluid, it has its own action that isn't according to our thoughts or our narrative. It doesn't give a crap about our narrative. And that energy acts through us and actually changes our narrative by us seeing that we're something beyond our narrative. So I feel like our brain is more at risk of breaking down, and it is in more and more people now, because we're not in touch with the real essence of what we are. And that essence can get in touch with us. It can blow out all those word concepts and take us on the ride of our life. So why aren't we living the ride of our life every day? So then our brain has this real strength of selfhood, of being a human being. So on page 37, Pia Kanto says, "There is something of who we are that exists separate and independent from cognition." And that's pretty obvious. But we're so identified with our cognition, and in map consciousness we become disidentified from cognition, and something else comes in. And it could actually be more real if we're able to really be acquainted with it. And when it first suspends or breaks up the cognition, it's like learning a whole new language. It's like being in contact with a whole new energy and not being directed by our thought energy. And so it can be scary, but the more we're in touch with that, I think it's actually going to change our brains to actually be stronger and in touch with that living vitality that we are. I'm pretty sure all of us have had that experience when somebody's telling us this long, drawn out story about their life and we're thinking to ourselves, I don't really care. This is boring. I hope they stop talking. And that could be the brain in general, just really bored with relating based on hearing about someone's past. That's really not life. What happens when we actually meet in the moment as two blank slates, as two human beings? And she talks about how the body has been relegated to nothingness. Yet there's clearly some intelligence in our embodiment, and we don't exercise that through our life. We live in our concepts and words about ourselves, and so that's not really rooted in anything. It's sort of loosely in the brain, and there's a part on page 43. It talks about a specific case where a man had a brain surgery that made him remember absolutely nothing each day. But then they had him repeat a task each day of drawing a certain thing. And even though he didn't remember doing the task when he sat down to do it the next time, each time he got better at it. So that to me relates to how if we go into these altered states, subconsciously we're still learning to navigate them somehow. We're getting acquainted with those laws of physics, with those energies, with those ways of moving, with those gestures, with those brain states. We don't need a me to help us with that. The me is actually the obstacle in a way. So just going through that can help us to adapt to that. And that person, Pia Contos, said, embodied selfhood is the idea that bodily habits, gestures, and actions support and convey humanness and individuality. So to me, this relates to epi-gesturetics, and actually it relates to when this energy comes in, it's an embodied energy. It makes us act differently, gesture differently, speak differently, behave differently. It's changing our embodiment. So it actually could be closer to our natural embodiment, even though it can be kind of chaotic. And so by getting in alignment with embodied mania, the way my body embodied mania, then I'm actually getting more in alignment with my embodied self. And that could actually help to eliminate those unnecessary structures in the brain that things like recovery try to tell us we're supposed to try and get back. I would say get back to the essence of mania, the embodied self. So I've been saying embody your mania, but really mania is kind of the embodied self. And of course there's some scary bits to it. I'm not saying it's all great, but the scary bits could actually be the interference of the false ego narrative structures with this embodied energy, and they're sort of overlapping, and it could almost be those two energies at war with each other. The energy of the ego thought structures of the past that have a hold on the brain cells, and the brain trying to purge itself of that through embodied action. So usually we think by analyzing our brain and our thoughts and everything, the thought structure is going to change. But Krishnamurti would say the analyzer is the analyzed. The element in our brain that we try to analyze with is the same quality, or is the same, just a different fragment of all the fragments we're trying to look at. And this energy in map consciousness, I feel, is of a different quality altogether that breaks apart all those fragments, and it's embodied energy. And so it's actually living with that energy and moving about in daily life, and those fragments sort of getting flicked away as we're moving in an embodied way with this energy. Instead of sitting and trying to analyze, we're living in that energy, and it's ridding us of those other structures. Not sitting around thinking that by thinking we can think and change our thinking. It's this whole energy coming through and changing everything that we think we know about ourselves in our actions, and breaking away from those structures that are congruent with our old ways of being. Because when we start to get in trouble in the process, it's when the thoughts start to turn against us. And then we're again acting based on thought, not acting based on that energy. So it's like the energy is dwindled out, the thought structures are coming back in, and we're again beginning to act based on our thought structures. But it can be scary because when that energy is still kind of there, the thoughts are definitely outside the range of what we would normally consider to be our thoughts. So then this whole control and free will question comes back into play. When we were in mania, we didn't necessarily feel like we had tons of control, but everything was happening so wonderful and magical that we didn't really question. We didn't say, oh, well, I need to control this, because it was awesome. But then when it gets scary, then we feel like, whoa, I better try and control this. But I don't think we have control of any of it. So again, that's when preference comes in. Oh, I prefer the good, and it's okay if I'm out of control, or there's no one really there controlling. I'm just moving with the energy, surfing the consciousness, and then when it gets scary, then we have to try and control it. And who is the I that's trying to control it? Really, it's the body trying to save itself from these thought structures. So there's an embodiment that wants to save itself from these thought structures. And it's pretty much a war. Will the thought structures win and destroy the body? Or will the embodiment act before the thoughts can act? And so the embodiment is actually deeper than these thought structures. And just like we can become really good at typing and not have to think about it, we can become really good at embodying mania and trying to discern what that energy was attempting to show us. And then we get our free will back because we kind of aren't ready to go quite beyond that illusion of free will. It's still quite a good illusion to have, or good model. And Kanto says, we all have embodied selfhood. You have it, I have it. It's just that when our cognition is intact, it goes unnoticed. It is sort of in the background. But when we have cognitive impairment, it comes to the foreground. And so bipolar could be thought of in a way as a cognitive impairment. But I question the value of all the cognitive activities that we do. A lot of it's a waste of energy and brain power, and I think it's actually damaging the brain. And even if it's not damaging the brain, it's creating these false structures that are very prone to decline. And they're possibly meant to decline, especially when it happens in bipolar. But what I'm saying is, by putting all our energy into this cognition process, we're not putting energy into this embodiment process, and we're at risk to having our whole world that we've constructed with our thoughts and our words and our narratives about ourselves fall apart. And that's a good thing. A lot of people have this crisis and distress and move through it and find more meaning in life. But it can also be really, really challenging, and there is something more real to get in touch with. And why aren't we more in touch with that real in the first place? And she talks about how our primary method of engaging with the world is through cognition. So when it's impaired, it's difficult to engage with the world. Well, it's difficult to engage with the world that cognition has built, but maybe there's another world altogether. A world that isn't based on cognition, a world that's based on being in touch with the real. And I think that's a world that we move with and start to move into in map consciousness. And we're starting to map those areas in the brain and expand the brain and change the quality of the brain and what it's able to respond to. And when that happens, the brain actually responds violently or in a very fearful way to the structures of society, to the structures of cognition. And it talks on page 75 about our sense of agency, that the brain creates the sense of being the initiator of one's thoughts and actions, and how in something like psychosis this breaks down. In my feeling, it's changing our sense of agency. So the process of so-called psychosis is showing us what real agency is, or what different aspects of agency is. And in a way, if the brain is responding to different information with all the senses holistically at the same time, instead of just what cognition is pointing out, then it's going to move us in different ways and it's going to feel foreign. So it's not like we don't have this sense of agency, but we're getting in touch with a different algorithm or calculation from our mind picking out a certain bit. Like if we're always worried about what people think of us or something, our brain is just thinking about that and wondering what somebody's thinking about us when they're talking or something. That's pretty trivial. And so when that false agency, in a way, drops and there's this in touchness with everything, there's something completely different. So what can we really do? We can watch, we can be aware, but just to attribute all this to this self that isn't really real. And I guess that's what the book is kind of talking about, that what is the self if there's all these other ways the brain experiences reality. And to me, the self is kind of, well, this is what's acceptable to operate in the society that we've created. And then any breakdown in the self is treated as a medical illness instead of any number of other things that it could be. And it's profitable to do so. And they mention a woman that was born without arms and legs, and yet her whole life she felt like she had arms and legs. And they even were able to show on a brain scan that her brain was reacting as if she had arms and legs. And that to me brings up Rupert Sheldrake's idea of a morphogenetic field, or morphogenic field, or morphic field, or whatever it's called, and how that map can be in the brain even if those areas of the body don't develop. And how this relates to map consciousness is that I feel like there's a greater map of self beyond what we have been conditioned to map as ourself, that sort of exists like a morphic field or morphic resonance that is kind of the next evolution to what we consider to be ours, or what we consider to be what we are responsible for. And maybe we're responsible for more than just our individual body. And I probably shouldn't keep spoiling the book because it's a really good book, but I'm trying to illustrate some things that I think related to what he says, but I will be more careful. So read the book. It's fascinating. And I was even thinking in terms of part of this mapping something else, is that I think the brain needs other brains who are equally willing to map this. So if I'm mapping this on my own, it's only of a certain energy. But if there's more people that see this and are willing to map this, and it's not a thing, it's not, this is what it is, it's right there. It's changing every moment. It's moving, it's living. So other people who are willing to live in that energy and move with it and move as that energy, and that unveils more of the territory, and that changes the brain to open up those maps in the brain to make those structures more available to other people. They're like these dormant maps that when we're in the state of map conscious, when we're in so-called mania, we feel much greater than we are. And sometimes that's translated into things like grandiose thoughts, but our brain is wired to translate everything into thought. So us thinking these grandiose thoughts could actually just be the thought representation of the actual energetics that we're feeling to the best we can translate it. But really it's just saying we are more than just this body, and that's not meant to be a woo-woo thing. That's meant to be we are in relation to everything. So if I move an orange over from point A to point B, I have just changed the whole universe to some extent. So there's some level of interaction and creating, being part of this universe and the creative process. And we think that we're autonomous, but we're not really. Like, we're related to things. We change things and they change us. As simple as we are what we eat, or things like that. So I'm the food I eat, so the food that is out there is important. So it's realizing that relationship and having a sense of that beyond just my little narrative and things like that. There's a greater language of understanding how what we're related to shapes us. And so in that way, it is kind of us. It's not really separate. And it's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to actually feel that and live in that energy, and it's incredible. But the trouble is that then we feel really responsible, and then that's translated into the thoughts, I have to save the world and change the world and it's up to me. Well, there is a truth to that it is up to each one of us. And we do have a tremendous responsibility, each one of us, that we're not seeing. And then when we do see it, we think that we have to save the world. And these thoughts that we have are the thought translation of what the energy is saying. And it's the best words we're able to give to it at the time. Maybe in retrospect we can give better words to it, or we can just say, well, that meant nothing. We can just say, well, I was just nuts, I was just crazy. Or we can try to remember that feeling of responsibility and what that really meant and how we can embody that in life. Because if we're able to embody that in life and that energy comes back and we're already doing it, what's it going to do? Not much if we're already on that route. So I don't really know what I'm saying, but I'm trying to speak about that energy in retrospect and translate some of this language. And in a way, a person saying, I'm God, or I'm responsible, or I have to save the world, if each person that didn't feel that way took that just a little bit and took a little bit more responsibility, maybe that would change the world. If people were able to see the truth in some of these things people are saying, instead of just passing it off as mental illness. Because anybody could be the next one to go through it. And it's also said that the brain creates maps for everything we perceive. So if our perception is expanded in map consciousness, the brain is creating a map of that. So our brain is creating a map of those territories that we visited in altered states. And it's a territory that's right here, right now. It's just a shift in energy, a shift in perception, a shift in worldview and perspective. So we have access to a different stream of information. So it's interesting they say that in the science, and that's what I was saying in terms of map consciousness and changing perception and changing the maps in our brain. That's partly why I call it map consciousness. And sometimes people born without limbs have that feeling of having a limb, so it's animation without incarnation, as it says in the book. And I feel like map consciousness in a way is animation without incarnation, because that energy comes in and animates us in different ways and makes us gesture in different ways and behave in different ways, but we're not fully incarnated in our embodiment to hold that energy and animate in that way indefinitely. We are programmed and adapted to animate based on thought somewhat indefinitely, but not really. And this energy can come in and break up that thought animation, and that energy is trying to incarnate. It's trying to incarnate into the brain to be the way the brain operates. So map consciousness is animation without incarnation, but it's up to us to incarnate it by embodying our mania. And it's also incarnation without animation, because we have this body that's incarnated, but it's not fully being animated by that energy. It's not really channeling all the energy it can channel. It's living in this narrow channel of thought energy. It says the body had developed fully, but somehow its representation in the brain was incomplete. So we're not representing that energy map in our brain. So maybe tomorrow I will talk more about Joe Dispenza and not read any more of this book yet, because it's really interesting and I just want to extrapolate it